a very good afternoon to everyone. Good morning, early morning, uh, good evening from everyone, wherever you are currently. So I would like to welcome everyone, the panels, our guests, to our second talk of the year by the Office of Postgraduate Studies, UCSI University. So today's topic will revolve around the art of speaking science. Okay, so with us today we have our four panels, each of every one of them great women in their respective field with various backgrounds related. So we have Associate Professor Dr. Crystal Lim Siew from UCSI University. Hi, Dr. Crystal. Okay, and also we have with us far away from the America, Professor Dr. Bhavani Turaisingam from University of Texas at Dallas, who is an expert in cybersecurity and data science. Welcome, Prof. Okay, and then from Professors Without Borders, ProWibo, we have Rachel Wanik and Yetunde Odunsi. Welcome, welcome. So thank you to all the panelists for letting your time today for today's session. Okay, so, okay, moving on to Rachel. Rachel, so Rachel here we have from ProWibo, which is Professors Without Borders. So Rachel is known as a specialist educator and learning designer. So Rachel has actually been worked with many institutions in the private sector as well as working with volunteering work, yeah, in all in I think most of our the world, especially UK, Africa, and Asia. So currently, Rachel is the director of programs and a trustee at Professors Without Borders. Yeah, in addition to she also involved with facilitating learning programs each year for ProWivo. So Rachel holds a master's in international management at the School of Oriental and African Studies, and she has spent 15 years in business, gaining lots of experiences in areas of finance and non-profit sectors. Which with most notably with Goldman Sachs and the UNHCR before she returns to education line. Okay, so as also the president and founder for Nature Ocean Indian, she leads a Mauritian NGO that empowers young people to be active change makers. Rachel is also a National Geographic certified educator, a Teach SDGs ambassador, and an executive committee member of the SADC Great Green Wall CSO network. So, Rachel, ProWivo mission is to increase equal access to aspiring learning experiences in higher education for people. Yeah. So can you share on how can we actually communicate science better equally for everyone, at a different level, especially for those underprivileged communities? Yeah. So I'll pass to you while I share the screen here, Rachel.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the lovely introduction, and welcome to everybody who's here. I'm sure, like me, you are hooked by Crystal and Bhavani's presentations already. I'm going to refer to those in a second, but first let me say that, yes, I'm here to talk about equity and inclusion in science communications. And if you look at our panel, it's no accident that it stands strongly on its own merits, and it's also female and incredibly diverse across multiple categories. However, I am fully aware that I am a white woman speaking about equity and inclusion. And I recognize that I stand with one foot in each camp in this respect, sometimes marginalized due to my gender, very often privileged due to my race. And I have additional privilege that also arises from being cisgender, heterosexual, native English speaker. So therefore, I hope that during the Q&A session, that all of you will jump into the conversation and share your perspectives, as these are vital to the conversation that we're having. So I had planned to throw out questions for you to type in the chat box. I'm aware that not everybody has access. So if you do have access to the chat box, please feel free to type in some thoughts as I throw out questions. The rest of you who don't, please just make a mental note and see what comes out of the discussion from this side. So with that, I'm going to jump in. And I wanted to say that this will build on some of the very important points that that Crystal and Bhavani raised. I think the storytelling is hugely important, relating to your audience by knowing your audience, and how Bhavani was using some brilliant analogies, and she used them in a way that was very compelling. I think that, I mean, if you didn't, at the end of that, understand the dangers that malware presents and be a little bit terrified by them, and decide, like Sophia, that you know, like her, I'm now committed to going and making changes after this panel. But traditionally, the science communications model that has been used has had some major flaws. Sorry, I'm just moving my notes along there. First of all, it has explicit and implicit biases. So these can be historical, cultural, experiential. These influence the design and the implementation of their work and their communications. So explicit bias is very obvious. It's characterized by overt negative behavior, ranging from subtle, such as exclusion, to extreme, such as harassment. But implicit can be the most difficult. Implicit biases can be the most difficult to overcome, as we are unaware of it, or we resist the idea of having it, especially those of us that value fairness. And if it doesn't necessarily align with our conscious beliefs. The reason that we have these is because, one, our brains are hardwired to seek out patterns and to take shortcuts. And we're socially conditioned by culture, media, and our upbringing. So these exist in all of us. And I found a very good example that was in a study published in the American Journal of Public Health. It found that physicians with high scores in implicit bias tests tended to dominate conversations with Black patients. And as a result, the Black patients had less confidence and less trust in the provider, and the quality of their care was lower. So here we see a direct correlation between the science communication and the result, which is absolutely the opposite of what the science communicators were consciously intending to do. Next, we have the deficit model. Now, the deficit model in science communications treats public audiences as lacking knowledge or experience, okay? In effect, it's the scientist saying, oh, this non-scientific public doesn't know or doesn't understand these facts that we have, and that's why they ignore us or they don't believe us. If we can just get through to them with this information, then they'll agree or act accordingly. Now, I think we can all imagine a few examples of this. Do you have any that spring into your mind immediately? If you have access to the chat box, please drop those in now, and we'll circle back to look at that. But I'll continue while that's happening. In the meantime, studies have shown that anyone with an ounce of common sense knows that this just get through to them idea doesn't work. This model also perceives the public as completely blank states. So it's, in other words, it's quite condescending. It's quite separate. It's a kind of a them and us model. So it's no surprise then that this tends to minoritize or marginalize populations and groups. Obviously, this idea of lack of knowledge is not entirely true in the 21st century, when many of us have internet access and levels of education are higher than ever before. Most importantly, it also discounts or dismisses types of knowledge that exist outside the typical Western scientific paradigm. This sort of Western white ableist and patriarchal approach that's been described in studies, for example, Canfield and Menezes. So what I'd like, if you, the next question I have for you is, can you think of an example one of these types of knowledge that that exists outside this Western scientific paradigm, where we are very focused on absolute facts, the model of the research that we do, anything that would be considered a system of knowledge that is not used, that doesn't normally come into this. So again, if you have access to the chat box, please drop your ideas in. I'm actually going to share a few of my own here. Indigenous and Aboriginal tend to be two of the big ones that we have discounted for centuries. In addition, there are other bodies of knowledge that are types of knowledge that have been developed and used in cultures outside Western cultures. So things that have developed through the centuries, through China, through Islamic cultures, etc. So we have the biases, we have the deficit model, and we have minoritization and marginalization of groups. And these three things combine to reinforce existing systemic inequalities. What's that mean? It means that these practices uphold and exacerbate racism, class discrimination, sexism, and other forms of oppression. So for example, think of traditional science museum visits where the visit and the exhibits, etc., are structured in a very particular way that isn't always accessible or welcoming to all populations, and therefore there's lower engagement. Think also of the debate around national parks and the idea of pristine wilderness versus indigenous land use and management. Or another one is lack of communications on the potential effects. And this one I found this morning, it came across my social media feed. The lack of communications on the potential effects of the COVID-19 vaccines on menstrual cycles, which led to widespread concerns about fertility issues. So I'd like you all to have a think along with me about what are the inevitable consequences of these factors. Specifically, what would someone who is not white, cisgender, heterosexual, and able-bodied feel if they were listening to a lecture or reading an article or taking a class that was based on the deficit model? Use your imagination or draw on personal experience. The ones that I came up with were things like disinterest, irrelevance, not understanding how that related to me, inaccessibility, perhaps through vocabulary, perhaps through technology, perhaps through physical space, opposing views and beliefs, maybe what I'm hearing or reading is clashing with my belief system, and cognitive dissonance. You know, I've heard all sorts of stuff in the media. Oh, this doesn't really correspond with that. No, I saw this on Facebook from my friend. I know it's got to be real. All right. Sorry, could we have the next slide, please? I'm sorry, I have jumped. Oh, no, we are. So here we go. So inequitable science communication fails to engage with groups. It makes information inaccessible. It's also about who is and who is not cited, credited, taught about, or acknowledged, and who and what is heard or not heard. This is the gatekeeping, okay? So the sanctification of science in this particular way, and it actively diminishes or minoritizes groups. Next slide, please. All right, so a very good illustration of who controls the narrative. These are two maps that illustrate, they portray global research production as expressed through science journals published in 2005 on the left versus 2016 on the right. It makes, I think, quite a dramatic point about the complexities of global inequalities in knowledge production and exchange. So please, as you're looking at it, have a think about what notable differences can you see between the 2005 map and the 2016 map. Are there any shifts in size that illustrate rising or falling in the ranks of global research production? While you're thinking about that and having a look at that map, I'll just make a few points here. English, for various reasons, tends to dominate science. And even more, not just any English, but very specific English. Something that we explored in a Professors Without Borders conference on publishing in higher education back early 2020 or possibly 2021. Like many people, I'm mixing up the 2 years of the pandemic. Streams of English that have developed independently from the sort of bastion of the Queen's English or Oxford English are still in many parts considered to be inferior as opposed to unique. And this is it's a very big thing that affects academics around the world, even academics who are native speakers, but they're native speakers in countries outside of England, Canada, the United States, and Australia. Then, of course, we have all the people who are not native speakers. So this puts a constraint on them. Let's also think about the privilege of research that comes from a place of interest. Outside the West, development imperatives and government policies pressurize researchers to undertake research that's relevant to their problems, but may not be appealing enough or even academic enough to interest the international journals. So I have a very nice quotation here. One scholar says, African scholars face a critical choice between sacrificing relevance for recognition or recognition for relevance. And another problem with the map is that it measures science journal articles as the only representation of scientific research output, although there are other valid forms. Okay, so if you hope some of the things that you noticed in the map, the differences between the maps, in 2005, the number of scientific papers published in the United States was more than 2 times as many as published by the second highest population, China. The top 5 were rounded out by Japan, UK, and Germany. Whereas in 2016, you can see that China grew in the rankings. It overtook the United States, but China and the US together published more than the next 3 highest. So you can see we don't see a lot of change from Africa, we don't see a lot of change from South America, and we don't see a lot of change in Europe. Right. So what is equity? This is the question. If we're looking for equity in science communications, what is it? It's a process, a process of reprioritizing opportunities and support to reduce or eliminate systemic imbalances and barriers to power, education, information, or resources. Okay, in simpler terms, we want to make everything accessible and we want everybody to participate. So how do we achieve this? Next slide, please. Thank you. So there are 3 very key concepts to employ: intentionality, reciprocity, and reflexivity. Excuse me. Let me just give you a quick word on each. Intentionality is the intentional consideration of your audience, your definitions of science, and how marginalized identities are and have been represented and supported in science communications. That is, it's the purposeful choice to deeply embed these considerations at all stages throughout your work. Reciprocity means that science communicators and audiences address past and present inequities through equal partnerships that recognize and value varied forms of expertise and ensure co-created benefit. So that's removing the barriers that create that us and them mentality and changing the monologue to a dialogue, which I had really hoped to do with the chat box. So apologies to everybody. And finally, reflexivity. It's continuous and systemic reflection on identities, practices, and outcomes, followed by, and this connects with something that Crystal was saying about using feedback, followed by adaptation as needed to redress inequitable interactions. So that means that the work is never done. Like learning, experimenting, designing, iteration follows iteration in a continual process to fuel steady improvement. Next slide, please. There's a beautiful example of equitable science communications done well. During the, and so this one is also is particularly interesting to me as I lived in West Africa at the time I'm speaking of. During the Ebola outbreak in 2014 to 2016, there was a heightened mistrust of medical professionals and an anti-Western backlash. Science communicators and public health practitioners, to overcome this, they tapped into the folklore and indigenous communication practices of the region's communities. Griots, or griots, are traditionally chroniclers of history, passing down the tribal history to the next generation. They're orators, lyricists, and musicians, and they're comparable to the troubadour tradition in the European Middle Ages. In addition, they act as counselors for their people, which is very important to this, and they often give spiritual guidance, knowledge, and advice using music and poetry. So the science communicators partnered with the griot and with popular musicians as well to utilize music to communicate key scientific and public health messages to communities. As an educator and a musician, I just love this. And this proved to be an efficacious platform through which science communication and public engagement could engender the trust and buy-in of local communities. It then engendered the requisite behavior change from citizens, positively impacting on the containment of the outbreak. So next slide, please. What did they do? They considered the context. And for a moment, I'd really love to hear very quickly from a couple of you. What factors might you need to bear in mind? You're going to say, run a campaign, okay? Or make a presentation. Consider your context. I've given this starting hint with gender. What are some of the other factors that you should consider while you're preparing, you're getting to know your audience? Please, please, just throw out one word. Nobody, nothing bad will happen.
Would like to answer Rachel's question? Anyone, feel free to use your microphone and just give your answer.
I see a hand, Hugh Yung.
Yeah, there's a hand there. Hugh Yung Kang.
Age.
Age, perfect, yes. Thank you. What else?
Perhaps I can give one, Rachel, culture.
Yes, please, yes. Culture, perfect, yep. So we've got gender, we've got age, we've got culture. What am I missing in my picture here?
I think we can also have like language.
For sure, Crystal, thank you. All right, in the interest of time, I'll move on. Next slide, please. So here are some of the ones that I've come up. It's not an extensive list by any means, but it captures, some of the major ones. We've got culture, age, gender, and language, as were shared already. Things like sexual orientation, ethnicity, disability, education, level of, type of, religion, socioeconomic status, okay? Think about your own, and then also don't forget to think about your own context, all right? Where are you coming from? What context are you operating in? And what values, perspectives, and biases are you bringing to the conversation? So remember, consider both sides. And almost at the end here, I'm going to go another slide, please. And I'm going to provide you with some things, some guiding questions that I feel are quite useful when you're preparing to communicate, this is a little bit of a checklist that you could use to run through. All right. Probably you are already using some of these, but it's definitely worth reiterating, and perhaps there are a few new ones. Also, it's worth considering them explicitly. Sometimes this is implicit in what we do, but to make it an explicit practice can be even more useful. So, who are you communicating with? We're talking about the context here, just as we were just discussing. Why are you communicating with them? So what determined the decision to communicate with this particular group and not another one? Why are they communicating with you? Okay, why are they going to read your paper? Why are they going to come to your presentation? Why are they going to listen to your music? Okay, is it obligatory, or are they genuinely interested? Are they concerned about or struggling with something? What do you want to achieve with this communication? Okay, look at Bhavani. Bhavani wants her, when she talks to high school students, she wants them to take action to protect themselves against malware. All right, so what are you trying to achieve? Are you sharing information? Are you inspiring action? Are you changing behavior? But don't forget to consider what they want to get out of this as well. Is it for the purposes of learning or education? Are they looking for solutions to a problem? Or are they trying to understand or clarify some information about a situation? Let's think about the how. How are you communicating with them? Is it written form or oral form? Is it in person, online, on paper? Are you using materials or technology of any kind, and are they appropriate? Are you using alternative methods, things like music, from my West Africa example, art, as Crystal mentioned, humor, which I definitely saw in both of those. And I fell upon an amazing example of somebody that uses dance in teaching science. How awesome is that? When and where is the setting appropriate? Is it relevant, and is it convenient to your audience? And what baggage have you unpacked your own context and your own implicit biases? So to wrap this all up, I'd like to leave you with an excerpt from something by Emily Polk and Sybil Diver at Future Earth, who summarized beautifully, I think, why inclusive science communication benefits everyone, not just marginalized or minoritized groups. They speak specifically to environmental justice, but I believe it applies broadly across all sectors. Incorporating environmental justice into science communication does more than support inclusive communication for marginalized communities. Rather, it benefits all people. First, by including the concerns and insights of the marginalized communities as part of the communication, we increase the social relevance of scientific findings. Second, by communicating scientific problems in a way that connects with more diverse communities, we invite these communities to participate in scientific knowledge production and thereby add important experiences and perspectives to a career field that historically has not been very diverse. This intervention breaks down hierarchies to encourage a more complete understanding of the world and contributes to building a healthier society for all, an act that has never been more urgent. And I'll leave you with one comment. In selecting an image for my last slide, I even struggled to find one that was well and truly diverse. This one offered, in my opinion, the widest range of inclusion, but are there any identities that you notice are missing here? Let's talk about that in the conversation, and this is yet another area that we can improve on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel, on the presentation on equality. So
And if I may jump in with a final word here, I think echoing these comments that it is an excellent question. I think also the parts of the strategy will depend on again, I'll go back to context. Are you trying to work with a group of senior citizens in Asia, right? In say Malaysia, where you have this culture of immense respect for your elder relatives and members of society. How do you incorporate that same respect in your communications? Or are you in a context where, say, we sometimes say that in the West we neglect many of our older relatives and family members. Are they coming from a place of loneliness, isolation? How can you address that in your communications? As Yetunde said, there's a lot of senior citizens that are active on Facebook, which is where you will never see a young person. So, if you want to go on social media and you want to reach, that population, make sure you're using the right channels. You're not going to go on TikTok for most of them. And just remember, like, are they coming from a context where, or a time period where, yeah, you put a mustard poultice on everything, or you chewed on ginger, you drank ginger tea, or like my mother is 85 this year, but she was a nurse for her entire career. So she has a very, very strong faith in the medical community. So, definitely there's going to be elements of your strategy that are particularly focused on the age, but don't forget there are other components as well. Well, if I'm gonna jump in here, there's two things that I've grown up with this. I've believed this for a long time, and it's reflected in a lot of the things that we're saying and hearing here right now, is that there is this complete and separation and break between science and creativity. And I would respectfully disagree with that. I think, every time you sit down as a scientist to write a paper, I mean, you're being creative with your words and your vocabulary and your choices. Every time you make a presentation, every time you design an experiment, I mean, there are elements of creativity that you have and you are already using. You're not using them in a particular way we've been discussing, but you have them and you use them. So don't underestimate and undervalue that. What you just need to do, like any muscle, is you need to build it up and flex it. And what I would like to do, with the permission of our hosts, I came across so many fascinating resources. I had no idea that there is an actual discipline and industry around science communication. And so I can share sort of some resources or links to resources. There's things like biosciences Toastmasters, the Toastmaster group that's specifically set up for bioscientists to improve their public speaking skills. There's a communication toolkit by the Association of American Association for the Advancement of Science, have an extensive communication toolkit. So there's a lot of great resources out there that I can share with you that I'm very excited about. There's the more general ones. There are specific accessibility issues for disabled people. And then of course there are the equity and inclusion resources as well. Oh, sorry, very cool one. There's the de-jargonizer. You type your text into, you copy and paste your text into in one box, just like Google Translate, and then it highlights in either red, orange, or yellow, depending on what level of specific knowledge that you need to understand this. I thought that one was brilliant.
Thank you from the panel.